Most people think building wealth in your 30s is about getting rich early. It's not. It's about changing the emotional physics of your life before your life becomes expensive to carry. That's the part people miss. They hear build wealth and picture luxury, status, some polished future version of themselves with perfect habits and a calmer face. But what actually happens when you start building wealth in your 30s is far less flashy and far more powerful. You become harder to control. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly, deeply. And that changes everything. Because your 30s are when a strange pressure starts closing in. It's the decade where your life begins to look more solid from the outside, while often becoming more fragile underneath. You may have more income than you did in your 20s, but you also have more ways to disappear inside your own responsibilities. Rent or a mortgage. A serious relationship or the loss of one. Children or the question of children. Parents aging. Career expectations hardening. The first real awareness that time is no longer infinite, even if you still act like it is. This is the decade where people start performing adulthood more convincingly. And a lot of them are terrified. That terror doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like busyness. Sometimes it looks like ambition. Sometimes it looks like constantly upgrading your life because standing still feels too revealing. A better apartment, better clothes, better trips, better furniture, better restaurants, better proof that you're doing okay. But if the upgrades are happening faster than the foundations, your life can become polished and unstable at the same time. That's why building wealth in your 30s matters so much. Not because it gives you permission to fantasize about retiring at 42. Because it interrupts the most dangerous psychological pattern of adult life, using money to manage identity instead of using money to build freedom. That pattern eats people alive. They don't notice it at first. In fact, it often feels good. They start making more, so they start spending like the new income is permanent, the new energy is permanent, the new career momentum is permanent, the economy is permanent, their health is permanent. They don't say that out loud, of course. Nobody does. But they build as if permanence has already been granted. That's what makes the 30s deceptive. You still feel young enough to recover, but your decisions are beginning to repeat. Your habits are hardening. Your standards are rising. Your peers are becoming mirrors. Every wedding, every promotion announcement, every new house, every vacation photo, every friend who seems more settled than you is quietly asking a question your ego hates. Are you behind? And once that question gets inside someone, they often make terrible financial decisions in the name of emotional self-defense. They overspend to feel included. They overwork to feel safe. They delay saving because the present feels more urgent than the future. They tell themselves they'll get serious later, when life is less chaotic. But life rarely becomes less chaotic on its own. It just changes costumes. That's why starting in your 30s is so powerful. It's not just a timing advantage. It's a psychological intervention. It is one of the first ways a person can stop negotiating with the fantasy that life will somehow organize itself later. Because later has a way of arriving with interest. And the people who begin building wealth in their 30s often discover something that has almost nothing to do with money at first. They feel less hunted. That's one of the clearest shifts. When you have no savings or only symbolic savings, everything feels louder than it is. A weird email from your boss feels louder. An unexpected bill feels louder. A health scare feels louder. A relationship problem feels louder. A market downturn feels louder. A bad month feels like a referendum on your entire future. Why? Because when you have no cushion, life doesn't just happen to you. It corners you. That creates a specific emotional posture. You become reactive. You don't choose carefully, you brace constantly. You say yes too quickly. You stay in things too long. You tolerate nonsense because your margin is too thin to fund self-respect. People think this is only about low income. It's not. There are people making excellent money in their 30s who live with the emotional instability of someone far poorer because every dollar is already spoken for. Their lifestyle owns their nervous system. Their apartment, car, social life, subscriptions, travel habits, and debt payments create a kind of beautiful prison. It doesn't look desperate. It looks successful. But internally, it feels like one wrong move and the whole illusion shakes. Then there's the person who quietly started building wealth. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just consistently. Their savings account stopped being decorative. Their investments became automatic. Their expenses became more intentional. Their lifestyle rose slower than their income. They didn't become a monk. They just stopped using every financial decision to soothe an emotional need. And watch what happens. Their mind changes. That's the phrase people don't use enough. Wealth building doesn't just change your net worth. It changes your mind. When you know you have a buffer, you walk differently into uncertainty. You don't become fearless. You become less available for panic. You begin to realize how much of your earlier stress wasn't just caused by life. It was caused by exposure. Exposure to needing every paycheck. Exposure to one emergency becoming a crisis. Exposure to jobs you can't afford to leave. Exposure to saying yes because saying no would create financial consequences you're not prepared to absorb. Starting in your 30s reduces that exposure before it hardens into your personality. Because if you don't build wealth early enough, you can start confusing survival mode with who you are. You start calling yourself driven when you are actually trapped. You call yourself high-performing when you are secretly terrified to slow down. You call yourself generous when you are financially overextending to preserve an identity. You call your spending balance when it is mostly compensation. That's the psychological value of starting now. You catch the pattern before it fully becomes your character. And then something else happens that is even more subtle. You stop needing every visible sign of progress. This is huge. A lot of financial suffering in the 30s comes from the emotional need to make progress visible. People don't just want to be okay. They want to look like they're moving. And because real wealth often grows invisibly at first, it doesn't satisfy the ego quickly enough. A growing brokerage account doesn't get admired at brunch. A fully funded emergency reserve doesn't impress your old classmates. A low monthly burn rate isn't photogenic. A decision not to upgrade your life never gets applause. But those invisible moves are often the ones that eventually give a person the calm everyone else is trying to imitate with visible purchases. That's the irony. The things that look least impressive in your 30s often become the most powerful in your 40s. Because wealth has a delayed emotional effect. At first it feels like restraint. Later it feels like relief. At first it feels like you're denying yourself. Later it feels like you rescued yourself before the pressure got worse. At first it can even feel socially confusing. You may watch peers spend more freely, live more loudly, signal more confidence. You may wonder if you're being too cautious, too serious, too boring. But many of those people are not freer than you. They are just performing certainty with borrowed money and future dependence. And that's a dangerous game, because dependence rarely announces itself early. It accumulates quietly. You become dependent on the salary level you once thought would feel abundant. Dependent on the bonus. Dependent on keeping up a certain image in your friend group. Dependent on the job title. Dependent on 2 incomes. Dependent on everything continuing exactly as it is. That's not wealth. That's a high-functioning form of vulnerability. Starting to build wealth in your 30s interrupts that before it becomes normal. You begin to notice that every dollar saved is not merely a number. It is a reduction in future humiliation. It is one less reason to tolerate disrespect. One less reason to panic over setbacks. One less way for fear to enter every decision you make. That matters more than people admit. Because by the time most adults hit their late 30s, they are tired in a way they didn't expect. Not old. Just tired. Tired of proving themselves. Tired of performing competence. Tired of solving emergencies. Tired of pretending adulthood feels more secure than it actually does. And when tired people get money, they often spend it in emotionally revealing ways. They spend for relief, for convenience, for a sense that the struggle must be worth something visible, for little proofs that their hard work is turning into a life. None of that is irrational in the shallow sense. It makes emotional sense. That's why it's so dangerous. The trap is not that people are foolish. The trap is that their spending is often intelligent self-soothing. And intelligent self-soothing is harder to challenge than stupidity because it comes dressed as reward, recovery, and self-respect. That's why building wealth in your 30s requires more than financial literacy. It requires the willingness to see your own emotional patterns without flattering them. You have to notice when you are using spending to regulate anxiety. You have to notice when your standard of living is being shaped by comparison more than conviction. You have to notice when you keep telling yourself, I deserve this, without asking what version of you will have to carry the cost later. That future version of you is real. More real than the mood you're in right now. And one of the great hidden benefits of building wealth early is that future you begins sending signals back into the present. You start making decisions with more internal continuity. You're no longer treating your future self like a stranger who will somehow absorb every consequence. That's maturity, financially and psychologically. A mature person doesn't just ask, can I afford this? They ask, what kind of life am I normalizing? That question changes everything. Because a life is not built from major decisions alone. It is built from repeated financial emotions. The urge to upgrade. The urge to celebrate. The urge to relieve pressure. The urge to avoid feeling left behind. The urge to not look small. The urge to convert money into identity as quickly as possible. If you don't interrupt those urges in your 30s, they begin writing the script for your 40s. And by then, the cost of rewriting gets higher. That's another reason to start early. Your 30s are still flexible enough to course correct without the correction feeling like demolition. Later, the same changes can feel humiliating because they involve unwinding a lifestyle that has become part of your self-image. In your 30s, restraint can still feel like strategy. In your 40s, if you waited too long, restraint may feel like retreat. The math matters, yes. Of course it does. Time, compounding, consistency, all of that is real. But the deeper advantage of starting now is psychological compounding. You become the kind of person who is less easily manipulated by appearances. Less likely to confuse income with safety. Less likely to mistake attention for success. Less likely to stay in bad systems because your finances are too fragile to support a clean exit. Less likely to use external polish to hide internal fear. And then there's a strange side effect people almost never talk about. You begin to enjoy things more. Not in the shallow influencer sense. In the real sense. A dinner tastes different when it isn't part of a pattern of avoidance. A vacation feels different when it doesn't come with low-grade financial guilt. A day off feels different when you're not haunted by how exposed you are. Even generosity changes. When you build wealth, your generosity becomes cleaner. You can help people without secretly resenting them. You can give without destabilizing yourself. You can say yes from strength and no without shame. That is a beautiful shift. Because a lot of adults in their 30s are overgiving from an unstable base. They are helping family, splitting bills unevenly, covering social costs, showing up financially in ways that feel noble, but are actually part fear, part guilt, part identity maintenance. They want to be good, needed, reliable, loving. But if your generosity is constantly eroding your own foundation, it isn't purely generosity anymore. Sometimes it's avoidance in a generous costume. Building wealth forces that truth into the open. It asks, are you helping from strength or from self-erasure? That's not just a money question. That's a life question. And if you answer it honestly in your 30s, watch what happens. You become less reactive, less performative, less impressed by people who are loudly comfortable, less willing to spend money just to create temporary emotional weather. You stop chasing the feeling of finally arriving through visible upgrades because you start feeling a deeper form of arrival internally. Not completion. Not perfection. Just structural relief. The knowledge that your life is getting harder to knock over. That your future is not being built entirely on hope. That if something breaks, you won't break with it so easily. This is where wealth building becomes almost spiritual in the most grounded sense. It teaches you to stop lying to yourself about what safety feels like. It teaches you that peace is not the same thing as stimulation. That confidence is not the same thing as consumption. That freedom rarely announces itself loudly in the beginning. It arrives quietly. In the bill that doesn't scare you. In the job you're willing to leave. In the weekend you actually enjoy because you're not financing your mood. In the argument where you don't have to stay because you can support yourself. In the month where an unexpected expense is annoying, not catastrophic. In the private knowledge that you are no longer one inconvenience away from emotional collapse. That is what happens when you start building wealth in your 30s. You don't just get richer. You become less fragile. And in a culture built on polished fragility, that is a radical thing. Because most people are trying to look powerful while quietly becoming more dependent. More dependent on income, on appearance, on constant upward motion, on being seen a certain way. They don't notice the trap because the trap is socially rewarded. It comes with compliments. It comes with aesthetics. It comes with the right neighborhood and the right vacations and the right language. But underneath, it often comes with fear. A lot of fear. Starting now is how you refuse that arrangement. Not by dropping out of life. Not by pretending money doesn't matter. Not by becoming joyless or obsessive. But by deciding that your inner life will not be built on financial improvisation forever. That choice changes the next decade in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't felt it yet. Because the first real taste of financial stability is not excitement. It's exhale. It's the shock of realizing how loud your mind used to be. How much of your personality was actually pressure. How many of your preferences were really coping mechanisms. How often you said yes because you were afraid to look less successful, less generous, less certain than the people around you. Then the pressure eases a little and the truth appears. You were never chasing luxury as much as you were chasing a feeling. Security, dignity, choice, breathing room. And money can't give you a meaningful life, but it can remove enough fear for you to finally live one honestly. That's why starting in your 30s matters so much. Not because this is the decade where you become impressive. Because this is the decade where you still have time to become unowned. Unowned by debt. Unowned by appearances. Unowned by the need to prove. Unowned by the systems you'd leave if leaving didn't feel so expensive. That is real wealth long before the number gets large. And if you build it now, even awkwardly, even imperfectly, even without dramatic results at first, watch what happens. The world doesn't necessarily change. You do. Your decisions get cleaner. Your fear gets quieter. Your standards get less performative and more real. Your future stops feeling like a vague apology you owe yourself someday. And maybe that's the real point. Starting to build wealth in your 30s is not impressive because of what it lets you buy later. It's impressive because of what it allows you to stop becoming. A person who looks fine, earns well, stays busy, and slowly builds a life they're no longer free inside. Start early enough, and you don't just watch your money grow. You watch your dependence shrink.